Hi, folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what some perceive as a vexing question as to how to reduce mass migration numbers to the West. So this is migration from the third world to the first world. Now, it's clearly the globalists are absolutely laser focused on this agenda of moving surplus populations from the third world into the most successful world economic zones in the first world. So the most successful economic zones in the world, other than sort of Japan, are pretty much all in the white countries, primarily, at least in the white countries. I mean, you could say, South Korea is an outlier, but in reality, it's all in the white countries. So the idea is that the globalists have is to move the brown and black, or move the surplus populations, which happen to be brown and black and peasant, into the West and create transform these places into white countries and the economic zones where white people are, largely irrelevant, or certainly a minority, and in some white countries they're pretty much there already. As I've mentioned a number of times now, in Sydney, when I travel into the downtown area of Sydney on business, it's often the case that I'm the only white person on the train carriage, or in the bus or the public transport medium. There's a light rail, like a tram thing, is on that recently. Again, you'd be lucky if even 1 or 2% of the people were white. So this is just how it is in downtown Sydney now. And even though the government says, with the 75% white, no, it's not. No, it's not. That's a lie. And again, the Australian government, like nearly all the Western governments, they're completely controlled by the globalists and run to the globalist agenda. But it does appear that certainly with the advent of President Trump, who is, I think, as I perceive it, is really the savior of the Western world, I think. And if he continues with these policies that he has and as more rigorously applies them, such as mass deportations and so on, then I believe and making sure funding from places like USAID and all these NGOs, cutting them off and preventing them from stirring up trouble and agitating and facilitating the mass migration and the transgender bathrooms and all the other stuff that is being used to undermine and destroy the fabric of Western society. But I wanted to focus particularly on in this essay on this business of mass migration. Some seem confused. Well, how can we stop mass migration, or what should be the formula? What should be the methods for stopping mass migration? Well, it should just be a government law or edict that's passed, because a lot of the mass migration is already transgressing many laws that exist on the books, already. So enforcement of the law could be one thing, but the reality is that migration in itself, just in absolute isolation, isn't a bad thing. It's the sort of people who are coming in. Do they fit in? Do they integrate? Can they contribute? Will they produce more than they take? And this type of thing. Basic questions that anyone would ask, and any reasonable person would ask. So the situation, as I see it, is very, very simple. There's a time when if you're hiring employees, for example, you would want to know that they could perform some service or function, or they could create value. If you want the technician to be going out and fixing machines, and you want the IT people to make sure the computers are all running, and you want the sales people to be outselling the company's products and knocking on doors and pounding the sidewalk and beating the bushes and all that type of thing. So you want people to produce more value than you pay them. Now, in the case of processing administrative work, they're not necessarily creating in themselves value, but they still got to process the bits of paper. So you still need some of those, and they indirectly facilitate the work of others. So hiring people, that was always an equation that you would put forward. Now, when migration began in Australia, and decent numbers of Chinese and Indians were coming in, or other Filipinos and that sort of thing, they all struggled to get work. Their language was piss poor. They had qualifications that weren't recognised. They had job skills that were required in bullshit companies and in businesses that in their own countries were typically the family businesses that had monopolies in a certain area and region. So they weren't competing, they weren't out doing things. The family that owned the business, they just swanned around in designer label clothes, looking important but never doing anything. They were just there to prestigiously sort of ride around on the white steed, looking big and tough, but they weren't doing anything. And the same goes for even smaller businesses that may have existed in the rural areas. All they did was take their eggs to the main street in the village once a day and try and sell them to whoever. There wasn't that they don't come with first world or really any business expertise, so they can't speak the language. They don't have recognised qualifications. They have no relevant first world business expertise. So they were often reduced, in fact, mostly reduced to the basic jobs like the cleaning or, selling flowers at the side of the road or something like that. That they weren't working in viable businesses or commercial businesses, commercial competitive businesses. They just couldn't. And when that was happening, and I remember sometimes I'd get roped into interviewing hopeful Chinese or Indian people. I'm thinking one here of a Chinese woman who the HR lady was off sick that day or something like that, and so the lady from reception came out and said, "Hey, Mr. Billy Bob, there's someone here about that job, and there's no one here to interview them. What do you want to do?" And so I said, "Well, I'll do it." And so I brought them in, and the job was to process requests for technical field service, to send technicians out to fix whatever, to take the request, book it in, and that sort of stuff. So the English had to be pretty good, and you had to sort of understand at least basic administrative procedures. Not that someone who was bright and keen and with it couldn't have picked it up. They could have, but so anyway, she's about 30, I suppose. Not a peasant in this case, not far from it, with a touch of sophistication actually about us. So well dressed and well presented, and she couldn't really speak English. She had about kindergarten level English, and with a heavy Chinese accent. So she's pronouncing it with the Chinese sort of phonetics, if you like, onto the English words, and the vocabulary she had was small, and you had to read. Now, I was already quite au fait in those days with how Asians speak when they speak English, so I was probably better able to understand it than many would, and I spoke pretty decent Mandarin, so I could kind of help her along there. But the point, the basic point was this. You can't speak English. You don't have any sort of qualifications that are recognised here or have any relevance in Australia, and you have no experience in this field. So the language issue being the bigger one, but the other things, I can easily hire anyone to do this job. Not anyone, I can easily hire someone to do this job, but English will be their first language, and they'll have some sort of relevant, be it direct or indirect experience doing this sort of role. And sometimes you have to explain and understand complicated concepts. Someone calls you up and I need my technical equipment fixed, and this is what's happening with it. Can you send someone out who can do this? That type of thing. She wouldn't have been able to do. They just wouldn't have been able to do it. So what was the point of even hiring someone like that? Today, it's very different because of quotas and requirements. Companies are literally being forced by government policy to hire those sort of people, particularly in the public service. So it's now gone the reverse. In fact, people who are qualified in doing that work are less employable now due to affirmative action and DEI, less employable than the people who are unqualified. It's done a complete 180 from how it was then. So she said to me, she was finding it really hard to get a job, and she seemed to be rather confused as to why that was. I'm sort of a well presented. I want to work hard. I'm eager worker, and there seem to be lots of jobs around here. So why won't you hire me? And that was she couldn't. I'm not sure she understood it as racism necessarily. I think that was in her in her mind. But the point that she had was, or that the issue I had was that she just couldn't do the fucking job. I had nothing against her. Again, she seemed quite pleasant and well dressed and clean cut, all the good stuff. But she said, look, I've been in Australia for X amount of months. And remember, this is before DEI and affirmative action, and Indians and Chinese and all the people from the third world were complaining they couldn't get work, or they were really struggling to get anything more than cleaning a toilet. So, and this is how it was. This is in a merit-based situation. In a merit, your credentials and capabilities alone are what's going to get you a job. You don't come to another country and expect you'll just be given jobs. And this was the bit that surprised me. She expected, having come to Australia, she would effectively be gifted some sort of job. In the communist Chinese environment, this is sort of kind of how it works, through connections and people and this sort of thing. And you're gifted a job as part of a wider organizational sort of thing. And given that she's not a peasant as well, she would have expected that her good quality breeding and so on would have elevated her to a higher status. But then she comes to a country where none of that matters. It's not your relatives and your friends and who knows you, although that does happen, of course, particularly in things like the big end of finance and that sort of stuff. But this was just a plain and simple, I need someone who can do the job. That's it. So her view was, don't you realize, sort of, to me, she was saying, look, I'm desperate. I've been for 1 million interviews. No one's giving me a job. Won't you please give me a chance? I tried to explain to her that she needs to speak good English. She said, well, I'll improve. No, I need you to speak good. I'm paraphrasing. I didn't use these words. I need you to speak good English now. But this typified the sort of exchange that went on in those days. Now somebody like that would be hired on the spot. Who cares if you're not qualified? Who cares if you can't speak English? We'll just give you a job anyway, because of affirmative action and DEI and quotas and the like. So as I say, it's a 180-degree difference. But those people were let in en masse. I mean, she would be at the more sophisticated end of that equation, by the way. And maybe in a back room, just doing accounting or crunching numbers, simple add up this column. She could have done, if that was a job, and it wasn't. Then she probably could have done it and may have been suitable for that. I got the impression she was a responsible person. So, so what do you do about mass migration? Well, the more you raise the bar, the fewer people come in, and it's the same for hiring people. If you've got a low bar or no bar, anyone who applies is a job applicant, because there's no difference. You're not applying a quality criteria to the selection process. Anybody can come in, and that's really what's happened to mass migration. And if you look at the amount of people that come in, whether it be in Britain or the United States or Australia, and the majority of people that come in are family reunion now, or chain migration, as they call it in the US. So just over 40% of the people coming into Australia are chain migration. So they're the relatives of people who've come. Now, the people who've come already are coming on a low bar, and now they're 40% of the total, over 40% of the total are chain migration. So the aunts, uncles, cousins, parents, and I don't know, whatever the fuck else are coming in. The whole village from some third world shithole are coming in. So that's the rest of students. Or another big chunk, the next big chunk of students coming in, and sometimes they compete for first place with the chain migration. But the students coming in, and they invariably, they're either for ghost colleges, people that can't speak a word of English coming in supposedly to study, and they magically get degrees because they've paid for them and they expect to get them. So there's a lot of corruption. Universities in Australia just turned into degree factories for rich Chinese and Indians and so on. That's all they are now. They're not a rigorous education. I mean, what a joke. And then these people expect, once they've paid for their degree, they expect to get citizenship, or at the very least long-term residency permits and work permits and so on. So they come in unqualified, unchecked. There's no high bar applying to them, and then there's people that apply directly just for work, to come in for work, that aren't temporary work visas, like they're going to pick fruit in the farms or something, just work skilled, so-called just a skilled work visa in isolation. Very few of them, only less than a third of them are actually skilled. About a fifth of those are skilled. So the reality is about 3%, approx, 3% of the total intake into Australia every year. And you could use this pretty much all over the West. About 3% are actually skilled workers, and the majority of them are white. And I just want to give you sort of an illustration of how many. I mean, you could look at say looking at doctors as a kid. Now, if you go to a third world country, just on average, they've got one doctor. This is a general practitioner, as far as I can understand. One doctor per 30,000 people. So let me repeat that: one doctor per 30,000 people in a third world country. These are like, the Bangladeshis and the African basket case places and so on. Now you go to a middle income country and you've got one doctor per 300 people. So now then you move into a first world country, then you've got one doctor per 100 people. These are average numbers here. So this will give you some idea as to how many, as in science, STEM, qualified people there are. So the number of qualified STEM people who and by the way, getting a degree in Liberia or Bangladesh to be a doctor, or India, any of those places, that the threshold is not high. The bar is set very, very low, and most of those doctors have got their qualifications by bribing somebody to get them. So they've got the bit of paper and they paid graft money to get it. But they're not fucking doctors or scientists or computer engineers or anything like that. So the third world standard of education and just the rampant corruption means that's heavily devalued. Something I found, every Indian that I hired who was supposed to be a computer science, computer coding, programming genius, none of them had that qualification. Not one. And every Indian that I hired, I had to end up firing because they just didn't have that. And they had no qualms about, so what? I told you lies about my qualifications and misrepresented them. And we're not talking about an exaggeration here that they've got a degree but claim to have a master's or something. No, I'm not talking about that. They couldn't even cut one line of code to save their lives, yet they were claiming to be a fucking top of the range, top of the town expert. So the qualifications in the third world aren't really worth very much, but it gives you an idea. If you're going to have a high bar of qualification, you have to speak the language well, to senior high school level. You have to have qualifications that are recognised, and we will test you when you come in. If you claim to be a doctor or a computer scientist or this or that or a rocket scientist, then we're going to give you an independent, rigorous, impartial exam, and that to test that you do have this knowledge and capability you claim to have. So you have to be able to speak the language. The qualifications have to be real, and we'll test them. And you have to want to integrate into our society. If you want to be sending money off overseas back to your country, we'll tax it at 50%. If you want to send back to your country of origin for brides and husbands, then you have to stay out of the country for 15 years before you come back again. You have to want to be part of this society and have the qualifications where you can contribute in areas of expertise that are needed, by the way. So by raising the bar, you effectively cut off nearly all the third world, but not all, but nearly all the third world people. So the mass immigration stops immediately just by introducing a high bar. Now, in the 90s, the mid to late 90s, when the government was ramping up the mass immigration, they claimed it's because there was a shortage of skills, which was a grotesque untruth, by the way, absolute grotesque untruth. But they, in order to allay the fears of the Australian population, will only make sure that people speak excellent English and have real qualifications and they come in. That's what we'll do. Oh, no, we've got a high bar. Turns out that they had nothing of the sort. People were flooding in that couldn't speak a word of English, and their only skill was pushing a broom or holding a mop. And they brought with them masses of corruption and all sorts of perversions. Buying up real estate and things like that, where you had illiterate, peasant cleaners who had $10 million, $20 million property portfolios. So the way to stop mass immigration is simply to that's all it is, just raise the bar. If you can't speak, if say you want to come to Australia or America, if you can't speak senior high school level English, you haven't got the qualification, you just can't come in. That's it. But I'm a refugee and I'm a prisoner. No. Then you have to go. We'll set up special camps with the United Nations for you, and you can stay there and learn English, and you can watch acclimatization documentaries all the time about how we behave in the West and how you have to behave, how corruption and bribery is wrong, and all these sorts of things. How you can't bring out all your peasant buddies from the third world country to work in your takeout food shop. All that, the total, what Western life is like. And you can stay at these camps until your English is good enough. And we'll give you rigorous, impartial tests to make sure. We'll also give you free schooling in these United Nations camps if you reckon you're a refugee. But once you reach a certain standard where you are valuable, in terms of what you can contribute, then you can come in then. So there shouldn't be absolute prevention, but that you have to meet the quality bar. You have to meet it. And the same needs to apply in all areas. The low IQ students that are passed through to senior high school and into college. There would be, in the days of merit, you were looking at 2 or 3% of kids that started high school would go to university. And today it's 40, 50%, pushing 60% in some Western countries. So clearly to get that, they have to lower the bar and lower the bar and lower the bar to ground level to be able to get those sort of pass-throughs, which is, of course, what they're doing with mass immigration. Illiterate third world peasants with an IQ of 70 are coming into the West as immigrants. I mean, no sane country would tolerate that nonsense. But the way to get around it is just raise the bar, and then that all problems are solved by that. We could come around to a more humanitarian thing, that some of these third world shitholes that have got one doctor per 30,000 people, a minimally qualified doctor at that, should we be facilitating the removal of that doctor from that country, from that place, when they've got so few anyway? Now, there can be various charitable groups, Doctors Without Borders and so on, that can provide medical care, but they've been turned into just activist NGOs now. I mean, are they really delivering medical services anymore, or are they just delivering activism? It's hard to tell now. But the issue here is raising the bar, raise the bar, and then fewer people will come in, and those that do come in will integrate and contribute, which is what's needed, desperately needed right now all across the West. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.